Hey, what's up, everybody? I wanted to do a little bit of a story time thing today since my best free time, honestly, is on my drive home and my drive to work. So I figured I'd go ahead and just do a little bit of a why did I start prepping sort of story time thing. And what ended up kicking everything off is back in high school when I was around, I believe, 16, give or take. What kind of kicked it off is, like everybody else, always something a little goofy. I mean, as far as modern day, maybe back in the day for like old time pioneers and everybody who is actually just being intelligent, they were just stockpiling for the inevitable winter. For me, I was actually just one of those guys that was like goofy young teenage kid playing Call of Duty and video games and stuff. And what ended up happening is I bought my first machete because where I lived in Idaho, at that time you could actually buy machetes and larger knives at 16 years of age or older. So I picked up my first machete, and it was on a Black Friday sale where I went in and I bought some Xbox Live points and things. At the time, I was working at McDonald's, and I was making, if I'm not mistaken, I think I was making about $4.50 every 2 weeks. So I mean, like breadcrumbs as far as money goes, but it was a part-time job, and I was working while going to high school full-time, so you can't expect too much. There's a longer story that goes along with all of that stuff, but let's get into the nitty-gritty, really. I bought that first machete, and that was like the first launching point for like my zombie apocalypse plan kind of thing. And it stirred on from there, and I get way more serious about it later on after a couple of life events. But I think I want to maybe make this like a multi-part series and sort of explain like step by step how things started all the way to the end of when I actually got to where I'm at now. And during that time, I was into video games, so I was playing tons of different types of video games and watching movies. And I'm not exactly sure which movies kicked it off. I liked all kinds of different movies and video games back then, so it's probably a combination of like every single one of them put together. And as time went on, I continued working there. I was actually a big pothead at that time too. So I was kind of a just a goofy kid all around, just doing stupid stuff. Typical high schooler hijinks, going out with the boys, sneaking out of the house every chance I could get without getting caught by my super strict dad, because he would have absolutely lost his mind. And as far as I can remember, I think the next significant moment was the next machete I bought. But I did buy a lot of other things in between that time frame. I got into airsoft with a lot of friends, and that leads on to a couple of other stories if I remember to get into them. They're not really like massively life changing in a sense, but they were somewhat involved in just who I am today and the reason why I prep the way I do. I had a farm that I lived on, and that was the majority of my adolescence and my teenage years. I would go out there with my airsoft gun because I had a couple of different ones. I had a handgun airsoft gun, and then I had a bolt action. And the thing about that bolt action is it actually had a pretty significant amount of power, for being just a spring compressed type airsoft gun. It didn't use CO2 or anything like that. But I could go out in the backyard and I could sit there and I could set pop cans and all kinds of stuff up all over the backyard and just sit there and blink at things. But I also had my grandfather's 22 that was basically handed down to me after being the family bicycle. When that got to me, at the time, we had a really, really big problem with rock chucks. And if you don't know what a rock chuck is, it's like basically looks a lot like a beaver with a different type of tail. And they're not, they might be cute to some people, but they're an absolute menace. They tear stuff up and they chew through things on your yard. They crawl up inside of like your vehicles that you're not driving, and they build these little nests. They're really a big nuisance. And by big nuisance, I mean they're huge. They are larger than your average house cat. And I mean big, fluffy, fat house cat too. But they grow pretty quickly. They just like constantly have babies. So they're just a flood of little minions that constantly go through all your stuff and chew things to pieces. And anywho, one of the things that would happen is on the back field of our farm, I would go out with the 22 and sit there and dispatch rock chucks. And well, I had a BB gun. That's what it started with at first, actually, now that I think about it. We originally were shooting them with a BB gun with a little scope mounted on there. And it absolutely would kill them, like 100%. You had to usually hit them actually in the head. Otherwise, it might just injure them. And we were not in the business of trying to just injure these things. We genuinely wanted them to die and not to just like die suffering for a multitude of reasons. One, because we weren't really just like cruel people who love to torture animals. But the other big thing was you really wanted to dispatch them so they would stop destroying your stuff. So there was multiple incentives to become a good shot. And one of the interesting things is the crosshair on my 22 actually had a broken leg on the crosshair. So you had to adjust to that sight in a different type of way that I think lended itself to me being a more versatile shooter. I got a lot better at what people call Kentucky windage, where it's just the amount of drop that happens after the bullet comes out of the barrel. I learned a lot because the 22, or excuse me, not the 22, the BB gun actually, it doesn't carry a lot of like straight trajectory to it. So you have to really get pretty good about arcing your shot in, or at least knowing like how your rise and your fall is going to be. I spent a lot of time out in the backyard just shooting all kinds of different things, pop cans and whatnot. And that got me into just already naturally having this ability to go shoot and enjoy myself, plinking and having fun out on the farm. And I would play these scenarios out in my head. They were like wargaming scenarios, kid version. And that started to kick off more of the mature thinking about like what would I do in sort of like conflict scenarios. What if I had to chase somebody down who was attacking our family? What if I needed to avoid people who were trying to kill us? Those sort of thoughts started me down a trail of like the soldier, like kid soldier mindset. I know for a lot of, especially the guys, you kind of know exactly what it feels like to like play army man soldier in your backyard. Well, I had an 1.5 acres to 2 acres to go play on as a kid. And when we first moved in there, it was like a jungle of weeds. We eventually started to tame it down by taking the tractor the little tractor that we had and knocking stuff down out there. So we got it a bit more tamed out. But I would go out and I'd play, and I didn't have the same amount of just veg out on video games thing as I did when I started to get closer to my 19, 20-year-old time frame. A lot of that time I actually did kind of bounce back and forth in between playing video games in the house on the computer or my Xbox, or going out to the backfield and actually just having fun. I would do things like make my own bows out of sticks that I found in the trees, or just run around and kind of make havoc and shoot at all kinds of different stuff laying around everywhere. And the cool thing is when it came to shooting the BB gun, it was kind of like free access. Same thing with my bow. I could go shoot any of the straw bales or the hay bales that we had around the house. And as sad to say as it is, my mom, she used to buy me stuffed animals all the time when I was a really young kid. And so I had like 3 boxes just absolutely overflowing with stuffed animals. And as I aged out, it's sad to think of now that I'm an adult. I mean, there could have been a keepsake or two in there that I would have liked to hang on to. But, being the destructive little teenager that I was at the time, just like basically every boy, I would take my stuffed animals out and I would practice my archery off of the straw bales. And that gave me a little bit more practical accuracy, where I could actually shoot at a determined target of a small size. And it honed in my ability to be able to shoot on the fly, because I did do a lot of like moving around and trying to quickly fletch my arrow, and the typical I watched it in a movie kind of thing, so now I want to do it in real life kid mindset. And that led on to the second machete. So the second machete, they're both a SOG machete, so cheap, mass-produced, crappy steel, old school machetes. I still have both of them, so maybe if I want to, I'll make my first 2 machetes video or something. I don't know. We'll see. But anywho, I was using those machetes to like chop weeds down and stuff. Oh yeah, I didn't finish the story. I actually went out on a second Black Friday sale with my at the time girlfriend. We went to Walmart just to check out Black Friday sales, and I found another machete. And this one had more of like the Tonto point to it, versus the original one had sort of a rounded top to it. And I picked that second one up, and that started like more of the what would I have in my zombie apocalypse gear sort of mindset. So it shifted the gear even a little bit further, but I still wasn't anywhere near like serious prepping. That comes far later on, when I start to get like a practical accuracy to it, instead of just being I don't know, me dreaming and messing around. I picked up that second machete, and at the time it was like that girlfriend that I was starting to date, she was like a heavy metal person, and so was I. So we were kind of doing the whole heavy metal cringe thing. She was a bit more on the gothic side. I was a little bit more on the my dad went to church every single weekend and I'm Breaking Bad kind of thing. So I was just like in a different stage than she was. We eventually did break up. I mean, obviously, compared to who my fiance is now. But at that time, both her and I were into more like the cringy horror movies and stuff. So I started to think of like wielding my machete as like my defensive, super cool, I'm a young guy sword thing. it was, typical teenage ridiculousness. And from there, I actually, we'll move the story further a little bit, because I was about 18 at that time. Well, I end up dropping out of high school because I convinced my dad that if I'm going to be a welder, that's the trade that I'm going into, that I really don't need a high school diploma. And I was right. You don't need a high school diploma as a welder. But that I was just going to go to a secondary school and get my GED. And then I was going to go ahead and just get into the field and start welding. And there was, it was a kernel of truth. I was okay with the idea of getting my GED. But the real thing is I just wanted to get out of high school. I wanted to be able to be more free and just go wild for a bit, because I was getting into that rebellious teenager phase where I've spent the majority of my high school age just smoking pot and being an idiot. And what ended up happening is I finally convinced him to let me drop out of school and put his signature behind it. And from there, I get in contact with my mother. Well, I was actually 17 at the time, come to think of it. Yeah, I was 17, because closing in on my 18th birthday is when I actually moved to my mother's. And my mother lived in Washington. So if you don't know, there's a significant amount of forest land when you go to Washington State. Not Washington, D.C. That's a totally different, that's in the east side of the United States. In America, Washington is actually on the west coast side of the United States of America. And it's just lush with huge green forests because it rains there all the time. I mean, somewhat like, I guess, the UK would probably be a little bit similar. And I finally move up to my mother's and I take a bus ride up there. So I managed to take a backpack, and I took both my machetes with me because they're my first preps. Those were my starter boy, get it done things. And I moved up to my mother's, and I took some other various knickknacks and things of that nature. I don't remember in particular all the things I took, but I'm pretty sure I probably had a couple of pocket knives and some stuff, backpack full of clothes and some shoes and whatnot. And I get up to my mom's house, and my mom is actually a pothead, because she's got old school pothead mindset, and she's got fibromyalgia and Crohn's. So it was sort of a version of self-medicating for just incessant pain. She spends every day just kind of suffering and struggling to keep down food and whatnot. So a little bit of pot helped kind of make the day roll by smoother. And because of that, and me being technically an adult at that time, she actually would smoke with me, or at least let me smoke. And we bonded over that a lot too. Of course, just because, shared hobbies. But one of the things that ended up happening is I started hanging out with my little brother, and my little brother was a pothead at the time too. And it was more frowned upon, the fact that he was smoking pot, but sort of accepted as, well, we're not going to fight you kind of thing. My mom's a little bit more on like the liberal hippie mindset. So she's not really as honed in, as strict as my dad, which I appreciate my father very much for being the man that he was, because he made me the man that I am. But my mom was more on the liberal, open, kind of smoke pot, make love, not war kind of mindset. And I'm kicking it with my little brother, and we would start to skateboard basically every single day. So I started getting in the habit of just like being outside the house, going skateboarding at the skate parks, adventuring around. And he had other little friends. And one of his friends is well, I don't need to tell everybody names and stuff. He was a good friend of my little brother, and he started kicking it with us. And he was a bit more on the mature side of like, he would want to go out and skateboard and do more grown up activities for how freaking young he was. So him and I got along pretty well, just in that mindset of like, I'm a more immature teenager and he's a more mature young teenager. So we would just kick it and hang out, go skateboard and do all kinds of stuff. And that ended up leading into us hanging out in the forests all the time. We would go skateboarding down these little trails, and there was these big bridges that they had all over the state. But in the cities that we were hanging out in, we would go kind of kick it underneath the bridge, homeless man style, and usually just smoke some weed and hang out. And eventually, what ended up happening is his grandmother, she was super wealthy. She, as far as I understand, she had made investments and was into like real estate and stuff, or something along those lines. I can't particularly remember at this point, but she was much more wealthy, and she ended up getting him some airsoft guns, and he had kind of this like mock AR-15 looking type of airsoft gun, and he had a handgun that was like the more pathetic, weak, spring-loaded one that, you know, it's like the thing would come arcing out of there slow as hell, barely stung unless you were like right up on the guy. But we ended up beginning to start to play airsoft out in the woods, and so we started to deviate from just like skateboarding on the trails to actually going out and adventuring into the forest areas off the trails just to like play airsoft, hang out. We found some cool little hangout spots. We found a rope that was like tied off in a tree, and I ended up actually getting up in there and taking the rope just because I wanted it. For what? I don't know. I mean, my mindset, it's like MacGyver, Rambo type thing. That reminds me, actually, we'll pick up, I'm at work now, so we'll pick up part 2 on the thing that I remember now actually being the origins of my prepper mindset. And we'll pick up on part 2 with that. That'll be a good cliffhanger for those of you that want to watch the whole series. All right, thanks for watching, and if you like this kind of stuff, give it a like and a share. Comment if you want to see all the rest of the parts of the story up to now. And if you enjoy this type of content, subscribe, share it with a friend. If you guys like Story Hour, do all the things. But all in all, thanks for watching.